In January of 1991, the Gulf War appeared to be unfolding exactly as American planners had envisioned it. From the outside, it looked almost surgical. Coalition aircraft dominated the skies. Iraqi radar systems were being dismantled piece by piece. Command centers, airfields, and supply routes were struck with precision that the world had never seen before. To many observers, this was not a traditional war. It was a demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority. But beneath that image of control, something far more fragile was taking shape. Operation Desert Storm had begun on January 17, 1991, with an air campaign designed to paralyze Iraq before any large-scale ground movement ever became necessary. The logic was clear. If air power could destroy Iraqi command and morale, a ground invasion might be short or possibly avoided altogether. The United States and its coalition partners were determined to minimize casualties, not just for military reasons, but political ones. The memory of Vietnam still lingered. This war had to look different. It had to feel controlled. Saudi Arabia was central to that calculation. The kingdom was not only hosting hundreds of thousands of coalition troops, it was also the front-line buffer between Saddam Hussein's army and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. Defending Saudi territory was non-negotiable. If Iraqi forces crossed that border in strength, the entire narrative of the war would change. What was framed as a defensive liberation of Kuwait could suddenly look like a regional collapse. American intelligence believed that Iraqi ground forces were unlikely to attempt such a move. Saddam Hussein's army had suffered weeks of relentless bombing. Communications were degraded. Fuel and ammunition supplies were strained. From Washington's perspective, Iraqi commanders were expected to remain dug in, waiting for the inevitable ground assault. That assumption would soon be tested. Along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border lay a small coastal town named Khafji. On the map, it seemed insignificant. A modest port city with little strategic infrastructure, Khafji was not a primary objective for either side. It had been evacuated early in the conflict and was lightly defended by coalition forces, primarily Saudi and Qatari units, with American Marines positioned nearby in support roles. To Iraqi planners, however, Khafji represented something else entirely. For Saddam Hussein, the war was never just about military outcomes. It was about perception. He understood that he could not defeat the coalition in a conventional sense, but he believed he could fracture it politically. If Iraqi forces could land a symbolic blow, especially on Saudi soil, it could undermine confidence, provoke fear, and potentially force divisions among the coalition partners. An Iraqi ground attack into Saudi Arabia would do exactly that. What coalition commanders did not yet realize was that Iraqi units, particularly elements of the Iraqi Third Corps and forward reconnaissance units of the Republican Guard, were already probing the border. These were not random movements. They were deliberate, coordinated, and designed to test coalition reactions. At the same time, weather began to interfere with the coalition's greatest advantage. Poor visibility, sandstorms, and cloud cover occasionally grounded aircraft or reduced the effectiveness of surveillance. For the first time since the war began, Iraqi commanders saw an opening, however narrow. Late in January, Iraqi armored columns began moving south under cover of darkness. This was not supposed to happen. The coalition's entire operational tempo was built around the assumption that the ground war would begin on American terms at a time and place of its choosing. Khafji threatened that balance. If Iraqi forces could seize the town, even temporarily, it would mark the first major ground engagement of the war, one initiated not by the coalition, but by Iraq. Inside coalition headquarters, warning signs began to appear. Reconnaissance reports hinted at unusual Iraqi movement patterns. Radar contacts flickered in and out. Forward observers reported noises and flashes beyond the border, yet no one could say with certainty what was coming. Then, in the early hours of January 29, 1991, Iraqi tanks and mechanized infantry crossed into Saudi Arabia. By dawn, Khafji was no longer an empty town. It had become the focal point of the first true ground battle of the Gulf War. And for the United States and its allies, it would become an unexpected test of doctrine, coordination, and resolve. The Iraqi advance toward Khafji was not a desperate last stand. It was calculated, limited, and designed to send a message. In the early hours of January 29, 1991, multiple Iraqi columns crossed the Saudi border under cover of darkness and poor weather. These forces included elements of the Iraqi 1st Mechanized Division and the 5th Mechanized Division, supported by tanks, armored personnel carriers, and artillery units positioned north of the border. Their objective was not to hold vast territory. It was to seize Khafji, provoke a response, and demonstrate that Iraq was still capable of offensive action. For coalition commanders, the realization came gradually, then all at once. Saudi border outposts began reporting contact. Qatari reconnaissance units confirmed armored vehicles moving south. American surveillance assets, once the weather cleared, detected multiple Iraqi formations converging on the town. By the time the reports reached higher command, Iraqi forces were already entering Khafji from the north and west. The town fell quickly. Khafji had been intentionally left lightly defended. Coalition strategy did not anticipate a major Iraqi incursion, and planners believed any such attempt would be crushed before reaching populated areas. As a result, Iraqi troops encountered minimal resistance as they moved into the abandoned streets. By morning, Iraqi flags were raised in parts of the city. This was a shock. For the first time since the war began, Iraqi ground forces were on Saudi soil, occupying a town inside the kingdom. International media took notice almost immediately. Saddam Hussein had achieved, at least temporarily, what he wanted, proof that Iraq was not simply absorbing punishment from the air, but striking back. Inside coalition headquarters, the tone shifted. American commanders faced a delicate situation. Retaking Khafji was necessary, but how it was done mattered just as much. A rushed assault with heavy casualties would undermine the coalition's image of control and precision. At the same time, allowing Iraqi forces to remain inside the town was unacceptable. The solution would test a concept the United States had long advocated but never fully proven in combat: coalition integrated warfare. Rather than leading the counterattack directly, American commanders made a strategic decision. Saudi and Qatari ground forces would spearhead the retaking of Khafji, supported by overwhelming American air power, artillery coordination, intelligence, and logistics. This was not symbolic. It was intentional. The defense of Saudi Arabia would be visibly led by Arab forces, reinforcing the legitimacy of the coalition and denying Saddam Hussein a propaganda victory. As Iraqi troops settled into defensive positions inside Khafji, they underestimated what was coming next. Coalition aircraft began isolating the battlefield. Roads leading north were hammered repeatedly, cutting off reinforcements and retreat routes. Iraqi armored columns attempting to move south were destroyed from the air before they could reach the city. Forward air controllers, many of them U.S. Marines, coordinated strikes with devastating efficiency, turning Iraqi supply lines into corridors of wreckage. Inside Khafji, Iraqi soldiers found themselves increasingly trapped. They had entered the town believing they would provoke chaos and confusion. Instead, they were being methodically encircled. Coalition air power operated almost without interruption, striking tanks, troop concentrations, and command vehicles whenever weather allowed. At night, thermal imaging erased the cover of darkness the Iraqis had relied upon. Meanwhile, Saudi and Qatari units prepared for a ground assault that would be far more complex than anticipated. Urban combat had never been part of the coalition's preferred plan. Street fighting neutralized many technological advantages and exposed troops to ambush and close-range fire. Yet withdrawing was not an option. Khafji had to be reclaimed, and it had to be done decisively. As the sun set on January 29th, Iraqi forces still held parts of the city. Coalition leaders now faced a critical question. Could they coordinate air, land, and multinational forces well enough to retake Khafji without turning the first ground battle of the war into a costly disaster? The answer would come over the next 2 days, and it would reshape how the world understood the Gulf War. When coalition ground forces finally moved to retake Khafji, the war entered an entirely new phase. Until that moment, the conflict had been defined by air power. Precision strikes, cruise missiles, and carefully controlled bombing campaigns dominated the narrative. Khafji would change that. What unfolded inside the city became the first true ground engagement of the Gulf War, and it would test every assumption made by coalition planners. Saudi and Qatari units advanced cautiously, supported at every step by American coordination. U.S. Marine forward air controllers operated near the front lines, maintaining constant communication with aircraft overhead. Artillery units stood ready to respond within minutes. Surveillance assets tracked Iraqi movements in real time. This was not a traditional assault. It was a synchronized operation designed to minimize losses while applying relentless pressure. Still, the reality on the ground was far more chaotic than any planning map suggested. Iraqi forces had dug in deeper than expected. Tanks were positioned at intersections. Infantry units occupied buildings, using upper floors for observation and ambush. Some Iraqi soldiers, cut off from command and supply, fought with surprising determination. Others were exhausted, disoriented, and increasingly aware that retreat was becoming impossible. As Saudi units entered the outskirts of Khafji, they encountered heavy resistance. Urban combat stripped away distance and technology. Engagements happened at close range. Visibility was poor, worsened by smoke, debris, and the lingering effects of earlier airstrikes. Communication between units was strained. Progress was slow, block by block, building by building. At several points, coalition forces paused advances, not because they were losing, but because American commanders refused to push blindly into potential kill zones. Air and artillery were used surgically, not indiscriminately. Each strike was calculated, verified, and timed to support ground movement rather than replace it. This caution mattered. In one critical moment, Iraqi forces attempted a counterattack from within the city, using armored vehicles hidden among civilian structures. Coalition surveillance detected the movement just in time. Air support was redirected within minutes, destroying the vehicles before they could break coalition lines. It was a stark demonstration of how American command and control systems functioned under pressure. Yet the battle was not without cost. Saudi forces suffered casualties, including several killed in close combat. These losses carried enormous symbolic weight. This was Saudi Arabia defending its own territory in a war watched closely by the entire Arab world. Every fallen soldier reinforced the seriousness of the moment and the legitimacy of the fight. Qatari units, smaller in number but highly motivated, played a crucial role in isolating Iraqi pockets of resistance. Their participation was not cosmetic. They engaged directly, coordinated with coalition command, and helped close escape routes that Iraqi troops still hoped to use. Inside Khafji, Iraqi soldiers began surrendering in growing numbers. Many emerged from buildings waving improvised white flags. Others abandoned equipment and attempted to flee north, only to be intercepted by airstrikes or ground units positioned along exit routes. The earlier belief that Khafji could be seized, used for propaganda, and then abandoned safely had proven disastrously wrong. By January 31, coalition forces had regained full control of the city. The battle was over. From a tactical standpoint, Khafji was a limited engagement. From a strategic standpoint, it was enormous. It was the first ground battle of the war, and it ended decisively in coalition favor. Iraqi losses were heavy, including hundreds killed and captured, along with significant equipment destroyed. Coalition casualties, while tragic, were far lower than many had feared for an urban fight. But the true significance of Khafji extended beyond numbers. For the United States, the battle validated a core principle. Air power, when integrated seamlessly with ground forces, could dominate even complex environments like urban combat. It proved that American command systems, intelligence networks, and restraint under pressure were not theoretical advantages. They worked in real combat. For Saddam Hussein, Khafji was a failed gamble. Instead of exposing coalition weakness, it exposed Iraqi vulnerability. Instead of fracturing the coalition, it strengthened it. Arab forces had fought, bled, and won on their own soil, supported but not overshadowed by American power. And for the world watching, Khafji delivered a clear message. This war would not resemble Vietnam. It would not resemble Iran-Iraq. And it would not become a grinding stalemate. The ground phase had begun quietly, cautiously, and decisively, and it would only escalate from here. In the days following the recapture of Khafji, something subtle but decisive shifted inside coalition headquarters. Before the battle, the war had still existed in a conceptual space. Plans were tested on paper, simulations ran flawlessly, air superiority was undeniable. But the true question remained unanswered. How would this coalition perform when men met men on the ground? Khafji answered that question. For American commanders, the battle confirmed that the system they had built after Vietnam actually worked. Intelligence, surveillance, communications, and restraint were not weaknesses, they were force multipliers. The ability to see the battlefield, to decide faster than the enemy, and to apply violence precisely rather than emotionally proved more powerful than raw aggression. General Norman Schwarzkopf and his staff studied Khafji in detail. Every movement, every delay, every success and mistake was dissected. What stood out was not speed, but control. Coalition forces had resisted the temptation to rush forward. They had allowed Iraqi units to expose themselves, then destroyed them methodically. This was a reversal of historical patterns. In previous wars, urban combat often dragged armies into attritional nightmares. Khafji showed that with dominance in the air, real-time intelligence, and disciplined command structures, even a city could be isolated, strangled, and reclaimed without catastrophic losses. For Saddam Hussein, the implications were devastating. Khafji had been intended as a psychological victory. Iraqi state media rushed to broadcast exaggerated claims of success, portraying the city as liberated and coalition forces as hesitant. But the reality could not be hidden for long. Satellite imagery, foreign journalists, and captured soldiers told a different story. Instead of shaking coalition confidence, the battle exposed Iraqi strategic desperation. Saddam's decision to attack Khafji revealed that Iraq was no longer shaping the war, it was reacting to it. The initiative had shifted permanently. Worse, the Iraqi army had just demonstrated that even when choosing the time and place of engagement, it could not withstand coalition coordination. Inside the Iraqi command structure, morale began to fracture. Frontline units realized that air cover offered no protection. Movement invited destruction. Static defense invited isolation. Iraqi officers found themselves trapped between orders they could not fulfill and soldiers who increasingly understood the imbalance they faced. Desertions increased, surrenders became more common. Radio intercepts revealed confusion, fear, and resentment toward leadership that had sent them into an unwinnable confrontation. Meanwhile, coalition unity hardened. Arab participation at Khafji carried enormous symbolic weight. Saudi and Qatari forces had not only defended their territory, they had done so effectively, disproving Iraqi propaganda that framed the war as foreign aggression against the Arab world. This mattered deeply across the Middle East. The United States understood this. American commanders deliberately highlighted Arab contributions, ensuring that Khafji was seen not as an American occupation, but as a collective defense. Politically, this insulated the coalition from internal fractures. Militarily, it ensured continued regional support for the coming offensive. And that offensive was already taking shape. Khafji gave coalition planners confidence to accelerate timelines. The fear of catastrophic ground combat losses diminished. The Iraqi army, once considered battle-hardened after 8 years of war with Iran, was now seen as brittle, predictable, and vulnerable when deprived of initiative. Most importantly, Khafji validated deception. While Iraqi attention fixated on the Kuwaiti coastline and southern border, coalition forces quietly prepared a massive maneuver through the western desert. Iraqi commanders, misreading Khafji as a preview of frontal assaults to come, reinforced the wrong sectors. This miscalculation would prove fatal. Khafji was not the main event. It was the rehearsal that convinced coalition leadership the final act could proceed with confidence. The battle demonstrated that Iraqi forces could be drawn out, fixed in place, and destroyed without requiring massive American casualties. It showed that Saddam Hussein's army, despite its size, lacked flexibility, cohesion, and the ability to fight under constant surveillance. By early February 1991, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. What remained was execution. And the lessons of Khafji would guide every decision that followed, from the opening moves of the ground offensive to the speed at which the Iraqi army would ultimately collapse. The war had crossed an invisible threshold. From this point forward, it was no longer about whether the coalition could win. It was about how quickly the end would come. By the time coalition planners finalized the ground offensive, the outcome of the Gulf War was no longer a question of military balance. It was a question of timing, optics, and control. Khafji had stripped away the last illusion that Saddam Hussein's army could dictate the pace of the conflict. What remained was an Iraqi force pinned in place, blinded, and psychologically exhausted by weeks of relentless air power. Coalition intelligence painted a devastating picture. By mid-February 1991, Iraqi divisions in Kuwait and southern Iraq had lost between 30 and 50% of their combat effectiveness without facing a sustained ground assault. Fuel depots were destroyed, ammunition stockpiles were scattered or buried, communication lines were severed repeatedly, forcing commanders to rely on runners or outdated field radios that coalition aircraft could locate and neutralize within minutes. Entire Iraqi brigades were effectively frozen in place. Movement during daylight meant near-certain destruction. Movement at night was barely safer. Thermal imaging and infrared sensors erased darkness as protection. What once gave the Iraqi army confidence, its sheer size, had become a liability. Large formations were easier to detect, easier to track, and easier to isolate. Inside Iraqi units, fear became routine. Captured soldiers later described days spent buried in trenches, unsure whether the next sound would be a bomb or a command to retreat. Many had not seen their officers for weeks. Supplies arrived sporadically, if at all. Rumors spread faster than orders. Some units believed the Americans had already broken through. Others believed chemical weapons were imminent. None of them knew what was true. This psychological collapse was not accidental. American doctrine after Vietnam emphasized something radical for its time: winning the enemy's decision-making process before winning territory. The air campaign was designed not just to destroy targets, but to overwhelm the Iraqi army's ability to understand the battlefield. Khafji proved the concept. When Iraqi commanders attempted to seize initiative, they revealed themselves. When they stayed defensive, they were slowly suffocated. Either choice led to the same conclusion. Meanwhile, coalition forces prepared the largest deception operation of the war. While Iraqi intelligence fixated on Kuwait's coastline, expecting an amphibious invasion, U.S. Marines staged highly visible rehearsals offshore. Fake radio traffic reinforced the illusion. Landing craft moved repeatedly within Iraqi observation range. Everything about the display suggested a frontal assault straight into prepared defenses. But this was theater. The real blow was forming far to the west. Under the cover of radio silence and desert terrain the Iraqis believed impassable, U.S. Army and Allied armored divisions repositioned hundreds of kilometers away from Iraqi strongpoints. This massive maneuver went largely undetected. Iraqi reconnaissance, degraded by air attacks and electronic warfare, failed to recognize the scale of what was happening. Saddam Hussein's command structure made the problem worse. Decision-making was centralized to an extreme degree. Field commanders were not empowered to adapt. Requests for withdrawal or repositioning had to pass through layers of political oversight. By the time approvals arrived, circumstances had already changed, usually violently. This rigidity stood in sharp contrast to coalition flexibility. American and Allied commanders were encouraged to exploit opportunities in real time. Intelligence flowed laterally as well as vertically. Units trained to operate independently could still coordinate seamlessly when required. Khafji had demonstrated this advantage clearly. Saudi and Qatari forces, supported by American intelligence and air power, had adapted under pressure. Iraqi units had not. The lesson was unmistakable. By the third week of February, Iraqi forces were not preparing for battle. They were waiting for it to end. Desertion rates climbed. Some units surrendered at the first contact. Others abandoned equipment and fled north. Coalition pilots began reporting columns of vehicles retreating without orders, creating traffic jams that became targets themselves. This retreat would later be remembered as the Highway of Death, but its roots lay here, in the silent realization that the war was already lost. Inside coalition headquarters, planners recognized the moment. The ground offensive was scheduled not because Iraqi resistance remained strong, but because delaying further risked political complications. The coalition needed a decisive conclusion that demonstrated control, legitimacy, and proportionality. Khafji had given them the confidence to move quickly. The objective was no longer to destroy the Iraqi army completely. It was to break it decisively enough that it could not threaten regional stability again in the near term. Every decision reflected this logic. The coming assault would be swift, overwhelming, and deliberately limited in duration. Coalition forces would punch through weak points, encircle major formations, and offer surrender as a viable option. The aim was collapse, not annihilation. In this sense, the ground war was almost an afterthought. The real battle had already taken place, in the air, in the minds of commanders, and in the trenches where Iraqi soldiers waited for something they no longer believed could be avoided. Khafji was the moment the Iraqi army revealed its limits. What followed would simply confirm them. When the coalition ground offensive finally began on February 24, 1991, it unfolded exactly as planners had anticipated, not because the plan was flawless, but because the enemy was already broken. In just 100 hours, the war that had dominated global headlines for months was effectively over. Iraqi resistance collapsed at a speed that stunned even seasoned commanders. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. Others attempted to retreat, only to discover that the very infrastructure they depended on no longer existed. Bridges were gone, fuel was gone, command structures were gone. What happened on the ground was not chaos, it was consequence. Khafji had revealed the truth weeks earlier. Iraq no longer possessed an army capable of coordinated large-scale combat. What remained was a collection of isolated units operating without situational awareness, without reliable leadership, and without hope of reinforcement. Coalition forces advanced not into a battlefield, but into the aftermath of one. By the end of the war, U.S. and Allied casualties stood at fewer than 300 killed in action. Iraqi military losses, by conservative estimates, exceeded 20,000 dead, with tens of thousands more wounded and over 80,000 captured. Some estimates place total Iraqi casualties significantly higher, though exact numbers remain disputed. The imbalance was unprecedented. But the most important outcome of Khafji was not statistical, it was doctrinal. For the first time in modern history, a major conflict demonstrated that air power, intelligence dominance, and information control could so thoroughly degrade an enemy that ground combat became a formality rather than a contest. Khafji was the proof of concept. It showed that wars could be won before armies collided, through surveillance, precision strikes, and psychological pressure applied relentlessly and systematically. American commanders took note. The U.S. military did not leave the Gulf War believing it had won because of numbers or technology alone. It believed it had won because it had mastered the integration of systems, satellites, aircraft, command networks, and decision-making speed. This lesson reshaped everything that followed. From Kosovo to Afghanistan, from Iraq in 2003 to modern deterrence strategy, the shadow of Khafji loomed large. The emphasis on joint operations, real-time intelligence sharing, and overwhelming initial force traced directly back to those early days of 1991. Even the concept of shock and awe, later popularized, found its embryonic form here, not as spectacle, but as inevitability. For Iraq, the consequences were catastrophic. The army that had once invaded Iran with confidence, that had overrun Kuwait in days, was reduced to a hollow force. Sanctions, inspections, and internal decay followed. The psychological defeat suffered by Iraqi officers during the Gulf War never fully healed. Many later admitted that they understood the war was lost before the ground offensive began, some as early as Khafji. For Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, the battle carried a different meaning. Khafji was the first time Saudi forces had fought a modern armored engagement on their own soil. Their performance, supported by coalition intelligence and air power, reshaped regional confidence and military cooperation. It was a moment of assertion, not dependency. And for the United States, Khafji became something else entirely. It was validation. Validation that the painful lessons of Vietnam had been absorbed, that decentralized command worked, that protecting soldiers' lives through technological and strategic superiority was not weakness, but responsibility. It also marked the beginning of a new global perception. After 1991, no major power could ignore the reality of American military reach. The message was unmistakable. The United States did not need to occupy cities to win wars. It needed to control the battlefield before the first soldier crossed a border. Khafji had shown how. Today, the battle is rarely mentioned outside military academies and specialist histories. Overshadowed by the dramatic images of the ground offensive and the retreat from Kuwait, it remains an overlooked turning point. But its significance endures. Khafji was the moment when modern warfare crossed a threshold, when information became as decisive as firepower, when speed outpaced mass, and when wars began to be won long before they officially started. It was not the largest battle of the Gulf War. It was the most revealing. And in the quiet streets of a small Saudi border town, the future of warfare briefly showed itself, not in explosions, but in the unmistakable realization that the outcome had already been decided.